Yep. So hello, everybody. My name is Kayla Rutterham, and I'm from Member 2 First Nation in Unama'ki, and I am currently living in Halifax, where I am a research assistant with the Counter Memory Activism Research Group. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Jibuktuk, Mi'kma'ki, the current and historically unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, and Passamaquoddy peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1726. I would also like to extend gratitude to the ancestors of this land, as well as the lands which you all come from. Counter-memory activism is an interdisciplinary research creation project between artists, museologists, curators, and scholars of genocide and memory studies, exploring the current questions and historical context of memory activism, as well as broader themes such as collective memory and the commemoration of heritage and difficult histories. This research project has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada's Insight Development Grant. This project is a partnership between the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design and the University of King's College in Jibuktuk, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Tonight's event will consist of a speaking portion and a question period. Questions can be asked through the chat feature, but they will only be visible to the moderator, who will then pose selected questions to the speaker. So I will be filtering some of the questions and then posing them to Dion. Our next speakers are Michael Rothberg on Thursday, March 18th, and Cyrus Marcus Ware on Friday, March 19th. The rest of the schedule for the speaker series can be found at countermemoryactivism.ca or on our Facebook and Instagram pages. Tonight's speaker is Dion Kaszas, who is an internationally acclaimed tattoo artist, cultural tattoo practitioner, painter, teacher, and scholar of Hungarian, Métis, and Nlaka'pamux heritage. He has been an invited artist at tattoo festivals, both national and international, and his work has appeared in Skin Deep magazine, the World Atlas of Tattoo, Tattoo Traditions of Native North America, and most recently the television series Skindigenous, which premiered in 2018 on the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network. Dion is one of the founding members of the Earthline Tattoo Collective, which aims to enhance, expand, and support the work of traditional and cultural Indigenous tattoo practices across Canada. Dion holds a master's degree in Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in Kelowna, British Columbia. His area of research is Indigenous tattooing, specifically the revival of Indigenous peoples' tattooing practices using Indigenous and creative research methodologies. Now, may I introduce Dion Kaszas.
Howdy all, I'm glad to be here. I'm thankful for this invitation and for the opportunity to share my work. I will just begin to share my screen here and we'll get started. All right, so Indigenous tattoo revival, walking backwards into the future. And, you know, when I thought about kind of the topic and the work that is being done in this research project that I've been asked to come forward and share what I have to share about the topic of, you know, memory and memory activism and all of these type of things, I thought about my own work and the way that the elders tell me, have shared with me that, you know, we as Nlaka'pamux people, as interior Salish people, you know, walk backwards into the future. So, you know, by looking back, we are able to move forward. And so that's, you know, the reason for the title. So I'd just like to welcome you to my journey and, you know, welcome to the journey of this presentation. This is a photograph of what I call or consider the gateway into the Stein Valley, which is one of the spiritual centers of my nation. And you can see these two rocks, you know, perfectly create this gateway that we walk through into the valley. You know, my ancestors would go into this valley to have vision quests, to gain power, to have their helpers visit them in their dreams and in their visions. And on these two rocks, you can actually see pictographs that were left by my ancestors. And so I always like to share this as the beginning of the journey that we will be taking together, is through and positioned in this spiritual way of entering into this journey. So I'm thankful to be here and thankful to have you on this journey. So I said that I'm Nlaka'pam. So the Nlaka'pam are, you can see the little star over in British Columbia. So we're in South Central British Columbia, and our territory is, joined by a series of rivers. The Fraser, the Thompson, and the Nicola River all go through our territory, and that's one of the reasons why Nlaka'pam is, the name that we share for ourselves. And so it's always important for me to give context to where I'm coming from. So I am Nlaka'pamux, Hungarian and Métis, and I would say that I'm a Bill C-31 member of the Lower Nicola Indian Band in the Nlaka'pam Nation. And that will become important later on in the presentation, but important to share here now. Here's just two photographs, one of me hand poke tattooing a pictograph, which is actually from the Stein River Valley, on one of the walls, the rock walls there. And then a picture of skin stitch lines by the eyes, and then hand poked underneath along the cheek. So I just like to, before I continue, I have collaborating partners through the Canada Council for the Arts and the IOTA Institute, who has been funding me in a research project that goes along with the work that I've been doing with the Canada Council for the Arts. So I just like to acknowledge their support as I move forward. And it was because of their support that I was able to dedicate a lot of time to reworking and rethinking my presentation specifically for this research project. So I'll be using an Nlaka'pam weaving methodology as we move forward. And part of this methodology is I will be sharing with you bits and pieces that I have collected, and the coiling will be up to you. So we're going to start at the beginning, at the center, and we're going to coil around and around and around. And that's the way that the ancestors or the elders have said that we walk backwards into the future in a circle. And so we're going to be circling around this question of Indigenous tattoo revival and memory. And you can see the little pieces of cedar which are wrapping around the split cedar root pieces there in the middle, and the connections that you will be making in your own mind, in your own experience, from your own way of understanding what is being shared, will be the basket that you will create from this presentation. So I'll be sharing bits and pieces that I have collected and harvested, from my life, and it's up to you to coil the basket of your understanding as we move through. So what can Coyote teach us about tattoo revival? I'm going to share a few stories with you throughout this presentation. And this specific story is a Syilx or Okanagan story. And I first heard this story told by Bill Cohen, and then later by Richard Armstrong or Chayuk, and then later yet by Jeanette Armstrong. And this is my understanding and my interpretation of this story. And I do not claim any rights to it. It is the intellectual property of the Syilx or Okanagan Nation. But it's a story that has really framed the way that I see things in many ways. So, in the time before this time, Coyote was out and about doing his thing, going for a walk. And as he was walking through the valley, just whistling along, and he looked up and he seen Eagle. So Coyote looked up and he seen Eagle flying on an updraft. And so in BC, we have really high mountains and there's a really high cliff. And when you get those winds blowing up against that cliff, it creates an updraft. And so, Eagle was flying and soaring across the updraft, playing around, having lots of fun diving and swooping on the updraft created by the wind and the cliff. And so Coyote looked up. As Coyote does, he got a little bit of a smirk on his face, and he said to himself, "Those are my ways. Yep, those are my ways." And so Coyote started to walk up the back end of the cliff, up the back of the mountain to get up to the cliff. And every step he would say, "Those are my ways. Yep, those are my ways." And he'd keep walking every step. "Those are my ways." And as he got further and further, the dialogue changed to, "These are my ways. Yep, these are my ways." And so Coyote walked up to the edge of the cliff, toes just hanging off of the edge of the cliff. And he looked down, he said to himself, "Yep, these are my ways." And so he stepped off the cliff, extended his arms out as far as he could, and he jumped, hoping to catch a little bit of that updraft. And as he quickly realized, gravity caught him, and he started to tumble down to the ground. And you could just see his little coyote arms swinging as fast and as hard as he could, and his tail twirling and twirling, trying to catch a little bit of that air. But of course, Coyote's body and makeup is not at all similar to that of Eagle. And so Eagle, or Coyote, flew all the way to down. Splat. Blood and brains and everything everywhere. And so, at this time, each of the animal people had someone who was a caretaker for them, a brother, a sister, a relative. And the caretaker for Coyote was Fox. And so Fox, heard Coyote's up to his antics again, and he's got himself in trouble. And so Fox, finally eventually made his way to the bottom of the cliff. And, he started to collect little bits of Coyote, a little bit of brain matter, a little bit of blood, a little bit of bone, a little bit of hair, and created a little pile. And Fox breathed life into that pile, and he stepped over it 3 times. And Coyote woke up, and he looked at Fox, and he said, "What are you doing? I was having a good nap. Thanks a lot for waking me up." And he walked off to do his thing as he always does. And so, I like to share this story, and I think it's an important story here as we begin this journey of understanding the revival of Indigenous tattooing. And a lot of times people will look at the revival of a cultural practice and get down on themselves and think very critically about how is it ever going to be possible for me to revive this practice, which my ancestors used to do in the past, but how am I going to do it today? Because I don't have enough, there hasn't been enough written, or there isn't any pictures, or there's no stories, or there's no oral history about our tattooing practice. And I always like to say, share this story and remind people that we are only looking for little bits and pieces of Coyote as foxes, collecting little bits, creating a little pile. And I always share that, it's not the fact that we have every piece, it's the fact that we have our own pile of bits of Coyote that we can breathe life into and hopefully help to transform the world as it is. And so I think it's important as we start out, a lot of times people have this misconception of tattooing. And a lot of times you'll hear this narrative that tattooing came to North America through Columbus and his sailing and his sailors, in contact with the Polynesians. But that's a form of erasure, erasing the tattooing that was present here in Turtle Island in North America. And very specifically in what is now known as the nation state of Canada. And so I just feel it was important to share with you some examples of pre-contact tattooing on Turtle Island. And before I do that, I'll just share two quotes. Evidence of the earliest tattooing comes from the discovery in Europe of several instruments that were used for tattooing between 10,000 BC and 38,000 BC. Aaron Dieter Wolf and his colleagues comment that indigenous cultures from every continent except Antarctica included tattooing as an essential element of their cultural fabric. So I'm just going to quickly give you a few minutes to look at each of these examples of tattooing that has happened across Turtle Island. And then I'm just going to switch, and I'm not going to give much commentary. It's just a visual representation of Indigenous tattooing across Turtle Island. So there's just a quick pictorial history for you of some of the nations that practice tattooing across Turtle Island. And so, you know, I'll be sharing little pieces of artwork that I have done that will illustrate this journey. And so in this little charcoal on paper, I'm looking out at you and asking, why are we talking about revival when this practice has been so prevalent and so ubiquitous across Turtle Island? Why are we talking about revival? And the story of the reason of why we are talking about revival starts with the doctrine of discovery, or the discovery of Indigenous lands. And so the doctrine of discovery is a Christian Western European conception of the legal rights of non-Indigenous Christian European nations having the right to Indigenous lands through the right of discovery. And so this is the beginning of the story of why we're talking about revival. And then as more ships and more boats came to Turtle Island, diseases came. And so many of the tattooing practices of Indigenous people include the transferring of names and rights and titles and very intricate and complicated governmental organizations and practices like the potlatch for the Northwest Coast people. And that included the transfer of a name to somebody who had the right to that title. And so with the devastation of some communities up to only leaving 1/3 of the population, many of these potlatches and these things weren't able to continue because there wasn't somebody who was there to have the title passed to, and therefore the right to wear the tattoo associated with that title. And then missionaries and the cultural erasure of Indigenous peoples' cultures and practices also contribute to the erasure of our tattoos. And so one of the other things that I'm going to be sharing with you is the voices of others, or friends, colleagues, who mentors, who talk about tattooing in their own communities. So this is a interview that I did with Corey Bulpitt, and he's talking about this very thing. So I'm just going to let this play, and then we'll continue when that's done.
And Mage'au was Florence's sister's husband's sister, was one of the last people tattooed. Florence says she was real ashamed of the tattoos on her hands. She used to wear gloves to hide them whenever she went out. I wonder why they let them do this to me, she used to say. So this was at a time of Christianity, and where, basically the old things had been taken out of us by the potlatch ban, by residential schools by that time. And, during her time, it was they were speaking English, and it wasn't even a thought to learn Haida anymore. For a while, they still held certain things. There was certain potlatches and things even eventually in her lifetime. Robert Davidson initiated doing a totem pole again, and there was there was things going on. But, it was very underground in a lot of senses, frowned upon by the government for us to be Haida, to live our lives as Haida people. We were a threat to them, and everything they wanted to take from us, and continue to take. So, the shame of that woman, it wasn't necessarily her being ashamed, I think, of who she was as a Haida, but just that Christian valued shame, brought.
And so I'm not going to give much commentary on the voices of those that I present, but just share them for you to begin to weave the basket of your understanding throughout this presentation. So another thing that was put forward, and you heard Corey talk about the potlatch ban. So the Indian Act is a form of legislation that defines who Indigenous people are, what rights we have, and also the things that we have to obey or forced imprisonment. And so the potlatch ban was one of those things. And enfranchisement is a process of the movement of an Indian person. So I say Indian in this instance very specifically because we're talking about Indigenous people who are found to live under the Indian Act. And so I have a card that says that I'm an Indian under the Indian Act and a member of the Lower Nicola Indian Band. And so enfranchisement, you would be enfranchised into the Canadian politic, and your right to live on your reserve, your right to any of those practices that happened on the reserve were taken from you, and you were enfranchised into the Canadian body politic. And one of the reasons for that was and continues to be, a form of sexist legislation that if an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man or a non-status Indian, they would lose their status, as well as their children would also lose their status. Another reason for enfranchisement would be the attending of university and the gaining of a degree, or serving in the military was another reason for enfranchisement. And this is Nahan, a Tlingit cultural tattoo practitioner and language speaker.
Yeah, for sure. We battle every day just to be who we are, to maintain and be alive as Indigenous people, man. It's some crazy statistics that we are at the forefront of every day. And that means, and just the fact that we're working to deny those for our communities, for each other. It's like, yeah, that's the war every day. That wake up. We got to realize that, and that's what it is, and so being able to look at that, warrior marks or things like that, how does that apply to what the person is doing now? Yeah. And how do you convey that for that person? Yeah.
I shared earlier, it actually was a slide that was out of place at the beginning of this section of slides that also presented the residential schools as another piece of legislation that was put through the Indian Act to make the attendance of Indian children at residential schools. And, it is said that one of the processes that was put forward for was to save to kill the Indian and to save the child. And so these are all these, not all, but these are some of the things that contribute to the reasons why we are talking about revival. When Aaron Dieter Wolf presented that the reality is that tattooing was practiced by the vast majority of Indigenous peoples across the whole world, with the exception of Antarctica. That doesn't mean that every Indigenous nation practiced tattooing, but it was a very ubiquitous practice. And so I'm just going to read this quote, and you can read along with me. In the best of circumstances, one's culture can be counted on to provide young people a measure of sameness while in the business of outgrowing childish ways. If instead one's culture is marginalized or vandalized or turned into a laughingstock, and if because of colonization or decolonization or globalization, the familiar and trustworthy ways of one's community are criminalized, legislated out of existence, are otherwise assimilated beyond easy recognition, then woe be upon those transiting toward maturity and for whom otherwise customary ways and means of warranting one's personal persistence often no longer suffice. And so this is a quote by Chandler and Lalonde, who did a lot of work on protective factors against suicide in Indigenous youth. And so, you know, I will be talking about suicide as we move forward. So just a bit of a warning that that will be part of some of this conversation. So I present this picture, and it's actually a picture of a rock shelter or a rock cave that contains pictographs. You can see off into the right of my cousin's head, some red ochre paint, and then in between Vicky and my cousin, you can see some more pieces of paint. This is a pictograph shelter, and I present it in this way because it really represents the way at one time that I felt about my culture and my community. I felt like I was always looking in to my culture and my community from the outside. And so, you know, this story about revival and healing and the work that I'm doing in tattooing is part of my own story of remembering who I am as an Nlaka'pamux person with responsibilities to my community, my culture, the land and all, and the earth and all that is. And so this is a picture of what it felt like for me at one time looking into my community and into my culture. So remembering ancestral tattooing, and I phrase it this way because at one time I didn't realize that we as Nlaka'pamux people had a tattooing practice. And so I always say that, you know, my understanding or the realization that we had a tattooing practice came in 2006 when I was walking in to get work done on my right sleeve, the tattoo on my right arm. And as I was sitting there, I would, you know, sorting through all of the magazines and articles that were on the waiting room table, as most waiting rooms have. Not that many of us have been, you know, visiting waiting rooms lately, but as I was looking through in 2006, the magazines on this waiting room table in the local tattoo shop, I came across this little pamphlet by the ethnographer James Tate entitled "Tattooing, Face and Body Painting of the Thompson Indians." And I said that I'm Nlaka'pam. Well, Nlaka'pam is the word for that we use to refer to ourselves, whereas the Thompson Indians is a word or a title that was given to us. And so this is a pamphlet on the tattooing, face and body painting of the Nlaka'pam. And so I always say that when I picked up this pamphlet and I read that my ancestors had a tattooing practice, I always say my head just about popped off. And I just couldn't believe it. And I thought to myself, even though I didn't have a bachelor's degree or I wasn't enrolled in getting a bachelor's degree, I thought to myself, I could do master's research on this, even though I wasn't, you know, on the way to even getting a bachelor's degree at that time. And so I always say that in 2006, the seed was planted for the revival of Nlaka'pam tattooing in remembering that we had this ancestral tattooing practice. And so the Four Food Chiefs is another story which I'll be sharing with you. And it comes from, it's another Syilx or Okanagan story. And I first heard it through Jeanette Armstrong and then Chayoch or Richard Armstrong and then Bill Cohen again. And it can be found in the book Kuskilau, We Are the People, published by Thetis Books. And the Four Food Chiefs is a story about the coming of us as human beings to the world. And so in the time before this time, the animal people would walk and talk like we do now. And the Creator came to the animal people and asked them, what will you do for the people to be? And so the people to be, of course, were us as human beings. And so the Creator was asking, what will you do for the next people who are coming to inhabit this plane of existence? Because, of course, for us as animals, we are not really that well adapted to our environment, especially when I think about back home, it being so cold and the wind coming through. You know, we don't have long fur and we can't really run that fast, so we can't catch other animals really well. We don't really have sharp claws and we can't gather nutrients from the sun or take up nutrients from the ground. And so the Four Food Chiefs, were the chiefs that represented all of the animals. And they came and they sat together in a circle and they put the question, what will you do for the people to be in the center? And that's as far as I'm going to share that story with you, because I'm told that, you know, it takes up to 2 days to tell, to get all the way through it. So I'm just going to share that little piece of that story for now, because it's what's most important for the rest of this conversation and the rest of the journey of this presentation. And so 2006, I realized that we had a tattooing practice. 2008 and 2008, I entered UBC Okanagan in an Indigenous Studies program. And then in 2009, the latter part of 2009, I started my tattoo apprenticeship, my professional tattoo apprenticeship. And this is actually me tattooing my mom's leg in the beginning of my tattoo apprenticeship. And as I continued to tattoo at the tattoo shop and to research in my undergraduate degree at UBC Okanagan, I began to study revival, the revival of Indigenous tattooing in communities that are not my own. And this is a painting that I did of Elle Manriquez, who is Tongva and a Jokma. And she says that these tattoos make waves. It says we are not extinct. After I got the tattoos, there was an emotional change. I felt responsible, a responsibility for my ancestors. People nowadays are like detached seaweeds. They don't have a root. But when blood calls you, it's too strong to deny. I just thought the physical marking would happen. I would just get the tattoo and that would be it. But it marked me in an eternal way. It has to do with being correct in the eyes of my ancestors. For me, the tattoos are a way of holding hands with my sisters, my aunties, my grandmother through time. And here's a charcoal and ink drawing I did of my friend and colleague, Tura Makina Dule. And in the top portion, you can see the Maori words. And then in the bottom, he says, a symbol from beyond our plane of existence, a symbol of mana or life force, a symbol of spirit, a symbol of knowledge, a symbol of understanding and enlightenment, a symbol of life. And so in the master's thesis, Expressions of Identity, Maori Tamoko and the Utilization of the Internet, Lingira Di Gora says, after more than 130 years of being kept in a state of limited power, the Indigenous peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand, conceived the Maori Renaissance as a form of resistance and reclamation of identity as power. And so in around 2010, as I was going through my undergraduate degree, as a way of making ends meet, I taught kickboxing at a local gym in Salmon Arm, British Columbia. And this is a photo of one of my students and I sparring as we're getting ready for a competition. And I share this photo because this is one of the what would you call one of the pivotal moments in my life that brought me to this work of reviving my ancestral tattooing practice of tattooing. And I had learned that we as Nlaka'pam people had a tattooing tradition. I started to learn how to tattoo. I realized the power of the revival of Indigenous tattooing in communities that are not my own. And then I came to this point of asking this question that the creator asked the animal people, and that in turn asked me, and I would argue asked each and every one of us, this question of what will you do for the people to be. All of those streams of understanding and knowledge came together as I sat at my young friend's funeral. So my friend here, who I taught kickboxing and mentored as a fighter, decided that he no longer wanted to be here with us in this plane of existence, and he decided to take his own life. And I would say that, I always express it as, the tears that fell from my face as I sat at his funeral and thought about, I just wish that he knew how valuable he was here. And I would say that those tears, as they rolled down my face, began to water and to nurture the revival of Nlaka'pamux tattooing. So Moko, New Zealand or Maori tattooing is about reclaiming a lost tawanga or treasure, a part of us that was taken away through the process of colonization, almost to extinction. It's my external way in showing that I'm proud to be Maori. And so this is a Moko wearer that gave their testimony about what Moko means for them, or Maori tattooing, in the article Renewal and Resistance, Moko in Contemporary New Zealand. And here's a painting that I did of a Haida man wearing his crest tattoos. So we've talked about the reality of the history of Indigenous tattooing, the processes of colonization, and some of the challenges that come forward through those processes of colonization. And when I began to think about the revival of Nlaka'pamux tattooing, I had an initial hunch. And that initial hunch was that our tattoos could be a way to anchor our youth and to keep them here. And I always say that if we could keep our youth here for another year, another month, another week, another day, or another second, that this work is important. And so that was my initial hunch, that this tattooing could be a way of embodying our culture and anchoring our youth and rooting them to this plane of existence to keep them for as long as we could have them. And Health Canada reports suicide is second to automobile accidents and deaths of youth. Indigenous youth are 5 times more likely to die from suicide than non-Indigenous youth. And so I always say, as I look out as an uncle of Indigenous nieces and nephews, this is something that really troubles me, especially in the connection with the other people who have decided to no longer stay with us throughout both sides of my mom and dad's family. And so in the article, Cultural Continuity as a Moderator of Suicide Risk Among Canada's First Nations, Chandler and Lalonde say they developed a working hypothesis that acts of suicide are best understood as the byproduct of a fractured or disabled effort to secure a sense of identity in time. And they found, after examining Indigenous communities that have low or no use suicides, they found that individual and cultural continuity are strongly linked, such that First Nations communities that succeeded in taking steps to preserve their heritage, culture, and that work to control their own destinies are dramatically more successful in insulating their youth against the risks of suicide. And so I bring all this forward, and I would say that my hunch that tattooing could be a protective factor against suicide or to the healing of our nations and our communities came from this quote from that little pamphlet that I countered in 2006, where James Tate says about Thompson or Nlaka'pamux tattooing that tattooing served preventative or curative purposes. And so here's some, it was that hunch that this was a way of healing our people that came through this little booklet, this one little sentence that started this journey of using tattooing as a form of healing. And here's my friend Corey, Haida carver and cultural tattoo practitioner.
On a daily basis, you know, where the tattoos become a daily basis thing that remind you of who you are. You know, you can essentially stop, you know, I think stop like suicide and different things that are big problems, you know, through having that kind of bond with each other. You know, you could maybe look at your arm, oh yeah, I'm part of this, and I can go talk to my clan and go talk to my people that can understand me, you know. So I think it can heal us in other ways, you know, that are more problems of nowadays, you know, using something old to fix a new problem.
So Lars Krutak, who was commonly referred to as the tattoo anthropologist, in the paper Power to Cure, he presents that 5 millennia of tattooing has been a permanent part of medical culture the world over. He further states that tattooing worked to help negotiate humanity's relationship with the body as it continually struggled with those physiological and spiritual processes that threaten to injure and destroy it. Krusak also states that among ancient and more recent cultures, therapeutic tattooing was employed for a variety of ailments to induce physical, psychological, and spiritual healing and well-being. The traditional use of tattooing by Indigenous peoples can be understood to be a medical epistemology or a medical form of knowledge. This medical epistemology or form of knowledge uses the insertion of permanent coloring agents into the dermis to induce healing. And this is Keone Nunez, the Hawaiian cacao or tattoo master, and he has been a mentor and a guide to me for a long time. And I'm just going to share some of his words that have helped me on my journey.
I've tattooed people as old as in their 80s.
Really?
Yeah. This is one kupuna that asked me to tattoo his leg, and I told him, well, you know, you don't need it. You've had a full life and all of that. He said, no, I really do. And I asked him why, and he said, because my grandchildren and great-grandchildren are coming with their names on the back of their arms and stuff. And we're forgetting who we were and are as a people. And I want to remind them of who we are. Yeah. And so you can't argue with that.
So this is a picture of my friend and colleague, Julia Mage'au Gray. And Julia describes herself as a Papua New Guinean skin marker. And in a presentation at the Traditional Tattoo Festival held in Kohala, Hawaii in 2019, she comments that the question should be, what does it mean versus what does it mean to wear it? because that's actually the question people should be asking. Not what does it mean? Oh, it's a centipede, I am strong. It's what does it mean to wear it? It means that I'm connected to my people, my old people's thinking. It means that I am the new old. It means that I am the ancestor. It means that when you look at me, you see everybody that came before me, and I know who I am. So this is Nihu Manu, or Manu Nihu, who is a Maori woman and comes from the PBS special Skin Stories.
My grandfather died in 1958, and at that point I was 4 years old. Now, in my mind, everything stopped. The death of my grandfather had such a traumatic effect on me that I stopped speaking Māori, which was my first language. Completely denied, if you like, unconsciously, that part of me. Being brought up in the Mormon church, you were a Mormon and you weren't a Māori, and rightly or wrongly, that's how I felt right until I was 30. I think that subconsciously, I've always wanted to have a moko. Having left the Mormon church, having made that decision to be more Māori, to take up an active political struggle, it just was a natural progression to stumble upon moko. So the yearning was awakened, and having awakened that yearning, it became a need to actually move it from a yearning to a reality. I had made the decision on a Saturday morning and called my mother. And she said, "Oh no, Manu," she said just in that tone, "if God wanted you to have that, you would have been born with it." And I said to her, "Well, if God wanted you to have clothes, you would have been born with those as well." To which she replied, "Don't be stupid to me." So we had it here. It was important that I had the people that mattered the most around me. There were about 70 people in our home throughout the whole weekend, coming and going. And so it was a big celebration, a weekend of celebration where we laughed and cried and had lots of fun and lots of anguish about how it is that we just about lost this art form. And then there was the jubilation of rekindling it in our own particular family. It was absolutely wonderful. I think it was my rebirthing. Because as I sat up after I had been completed, there was this overwhelming sense of rebirth. Just, I sat up and the tears just flowed. I sobbed, literally sobbed. Grandfather died in 1958, and at that point I was...
So this is a painting I did of my friend Nahan, who again is a Tlingit cultural tattoo practitioner, knowledge keeper, and language instructor. And he shares that sometimes clients will have cut marks on their wrists. Some people are cutters, and sometimes they don't want to show it anymore. They don't want to see that every day. And so when I do cover up some of those scars, it is firsthand showing me that they're putting their culture on top of the pain, on top of the traumatic experiences that they have endured. This is Pauline Alvarez.
We mark ourselves, like we reclaim our indigeneity, but also like we're reclaiming our body.
So we finished the 4th Earthline Tattoo Training Residency. Just off 3:30 in the morning, on my way to the Regina Airport, on my way to Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Sorry, I didn't realize that extra bit was on there.
We mark ourselves, like we reclaim.
This is Tahoti, and he is from Tahiti, and is a really dear colleague and friend of mine.
It take many years to find where's the connection. You need to use the connection that symbol they're going to put on your body. Because for us, you don't tattoo on your skin. It's spirit too, because it's on you for life. So it's important to carry what you believe, connect it. I love my culture, I love my ancestors, and I connect it for life. Make my identity, know who I am. The whole tension, I am tension, I'm descending. So I keep going down in this crazy world.
This is Elle Festin, who is from the Philippines, Filipino-American, involved in the revival of their tattooing practices.
Just seeing how them looking in the mirror going, like they could see themselves, their reflection of it, their real selves, you know, the man, the ancestor. They could see themselves being an ancestor. How happy they are. Like it's alive. That whole thing was alive. So I could feel it, but I wasn't awake yet. You know, like how a dream is. You know, you keep just going along with the dream, you know, until it wakes you up. So I could see that happening, and it fueled me more. I'm like, oh, there. Just seeing how.
So I wanted to present also, you know, not only the revival of our ancestral tattooing practices as designs, as marks, but also the use of our ancestral cultural methods of tattooing. And so on the left, you can see hand poke, and on the right, you can see skin stitching. And so hand poke is fairly self-explanatory. You're just holding a needle and using your hand to poke the ink into the skin. And then for skin stitching, you're using a needle and a piece of thread, and you dip the thread into the ink, which holds the ink, and then you put that underneath the layer of skin, in and out, and pull it all the way through. No thread stays underneath. You just essentially create a tunnel filled with ink. And so this is one of the ancestral methods of my ancestors, the Nlaka'pamux, as well as a variety of other nations across Turtle Island. And we ask the question, why are ancestral methods important? And here's Coyote.
And the reason why I think these are important is because, you know what? When I was first tattooing, I didn't have a choice. That was the machine, and that was it. But, you know, I would rather have work done with this, because this truly represents who we are. When you lie down here on these mats, you're taken back 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago, and you understand what your ancestors went through. No ifs, ands, or buts. You understand. There's very little that can be done today that takes you back that much, that immediately. Yeah. And this is developed by our own people. And the machine was developed by the same people that killed our families, took away our lands. And why should we allow that to determine how Hawaiian or how Polynesian we are? This is the determining factor, not a machine. But that's how I feel, and other people may not feel that way, and that's fine, but that's how I feel.
Again, Coyote.
It becomes something essential for you in understanding who you are as an individual receiving it. And it humbles you as a person that is doing the work, because through your hands, your ancestors live.
So walking backwards towards the future, I'm just going to share a little bit of the work that I do, have done in the past, as well as continue to do into the future. So here's a photograph of a pictograph, the Man Pictograph, which is found in the Stein River Valley. It's very hard to see, but through the enhancement, computer enhancement software called D-Stretch, we're able to see this pictograph of the Man. And then I've created a tattoo from that pictograph, a stylized version for, this is my sister on her back. And so I mentioned that the work that I do is currently funded through the Canada Council for the Arts. And this is a photograph that was taken at the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. And it is one of our most, what would you say, most famous painted skin robes. So you can see the red ochre paint on the bottom of the robe, and then which is called an Earthline, and then you can see the arrow and then the morning star. So this is the Earth and Morning Star robe. And part of what I do is, in taking Nlaka'pamux tattooing to the world, is to visit these museum collections, to visit the ancestors who are housed here, to let them know that we are still here, that they're not alone, and to speak with them, to commune with them, and to, you know, revive them, and to share my mana so that they can continue to live in these places for us to go and visit. And so what I do is I go and I document these different cultural objects. Some people will call them artifacts, but some of the ancestors that are housed in these museum collections, I'll go and document them. And then I'll take them and start to transform them into two-dimensional form. So I'm creating a visual dictionary from the work, from the baskets and the other visual and material culture that I visit, whether it be rock art, painted clothing, or the basketry designs. And so I will be taking all of these images, finding out in the anthropological and ethnographic record any interpretations of what the designs means, and then I'll be going to the community and asking, what do we say these are? Or I'll say, does our interpretation match what the anthropologists say? And then from that, I have started a project called the Nlaka'pamux Blackwork project, where I take these designs that are found on basketry, on painted clothing, on rock, and transform them to full body suit tattoos. And so this is one of the designs which then I transferred to a mannequin to show how this may fit on the body. And then one of my community members has requested that I tattoo this on them. And so this is part of my Canada Council for the Arts grant of creating this contemporary version of Nlaka'pamux tattooing. And here's me tattooing that design. This is my brother-in-law, and you can see the photo or the picture, the reference of the tattoo that I'm drawing on his leg. And so these are all taken from the basketry designs and patterns that I have collected throughout this research. And then we're tattooing it. And here's a shot of the tattoo just as line work. We'll be filling it all in with black at a later date and a later time. So I have a lot of collaborators for this project in British Columbia, but if there's any Nova Scotia folks who'd like to get Nlaka'pamux Blackwork, go to indigenoustattooing.com/blog and check it out. Just a little call out there for that. And then another part of my project is creating bone needles. So right now we use metal needles, and we used to use bone needles. And so these are bone needles that I seen at the Canadian Museum of History. And then I went to and was sponsored by Canada Council to go to Hawaii to spend time with Coyote, and he taught me how they manufacture the bone needles that they use in their hand tapping tools. I didn't go there to learn how to make hand tapping tools, but to learn what they do to make, so that I could bring that back here so we could create bone skin stitch and hand poke needles for our tattooing here in Turtle Island. So this is one of the first bone needles that I made in Hawaii. And then as I was about to leave and go to New Zealand for another event, another part of my project, Coyote asked, well, what are you going to do with this first needle that you made? And I said, well, I'm probably just going to try it out before I leave. And he said, well, who are you going to try it out on? And I said, well, I'll probably just do it on my own leg. And Coyote said, well, why don't you use it on me? And so it was quite a great honor to be able to skin stitch Coyote with a bone needle made in his workshop. So it's a great honor, but the revival of Nlaka'pamux tattooing is taking another step towards our ancestral practices. And here's a photo of the skin stitch lines that we did on Coyote with bone. Here is a short video of bone needle that I used on a friend of mine. So you can see that's actually a really big needle. The metal needles we use are actually quite a bit smaller, but it seems that the skin is much more resilient when using the bone. So another thing that I do is teach the next generation. And so these are some interior Salish Indigenous folks from my nation and other nations surrounding. And we did a tattoo training during quarantine. So it was pretty interesting to try and do all this stuff over virtually. So we'll be continuing more once we can visit together. So this is a quote that I put forward as the practice of ancestral tattooing by Indigenous peoples today is a powerful declaration of our continued existence, pride, and struggle. The wearing of our ancestral marks is an assertion of our rights, responsibility, and relationship to the earth and all that is. The moment we mark ourselves with designs inspired by our ancestors, we are taking a stand against the destructive, genocidal, assimilative forces that have been enacted upon us by the government of Canada. And so I always get asked the question, why do I tattoo? Why am I involved in the revival of my ancestral tattooing practice? And this is my nephew, Tyler, and the revival of Nlaka'pamux tattooing is my answer to the creator's question, what will you do for the people to be? And I hope that one day the ancestors and the people to be will not be worried about the revival of a tattooing practice. They will be living in a practice. And James Tate said that at one time, nobody over the age of puberty was without a tattoo. And so I hope all across Turtle Island, our practices will have a practitioner in each community and we'll be wearing our marks as we did in the past. And so this is the same rock shelter that I talked about in the beginning, where I felt like I was standing outside of my culture looking in. And now throughout this process of the revival of Nlaka'pamux tattooing, I look from inside my culture out into the world, and I feel safe and secure in Mother Earth. And so thank you for journeying with me. These are my friends as we left the Stein Valley and we walked back through those gates as we finished off our journey. And so thank you for journeying with me in this presentation. And I guess we'll move to questions.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much, Dion. So Kayla, I guess we'll just facilitate the Q&A now, if that's cool. So everyone just type in your questions, please, in the chat, and we'll be able to relay them directly to Dion, or if there's someone that we know that would like to say use their voice, then we may let that happen as well. But anyways, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dion. Well, while people are typing, I could actually ask the first one because I know it's always sorry, I'll turn off my video. Your Canada Council research is, I mean, it's frankly, it's amazing, and it's so thorough. So Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm wondering if you'd be interested in maybe just maybe furthering that conversation within the context of repatriation and how that sort of contacts with this research and how you're distributing it and sharing it to your community.
Yeah, definitely. I always talk about, when you go to any museum, they always ask you to sign a little document that says you're not going to be, sharing the photographs that you use, that you've taken. But I always think about the taking of these photographs and the using of the imagery as a form of visual repatriation. So, at one time, the baskets, say, for example, lived in our communities, lived in our houses, were used for collecting berries or for cooking. And, I would say that I always talk about it as these this visual language no longer inhabits our everyday Indigenous Nlaka'pamux universe. And so by repatriating these images from museum collections, we're beginning to allow our ancestors to speak to us from the past into the present for the future. And when I think about, the use of this knowledge, I always ensure that a lot of times in academia, or researchers come to communities and, extract knowledge and use that to further their own careers as they move forward as academics or as researchers or as artists sometimes. And I always think that I have to find a way to, as a Indigenous methodology, I have to find a way of building a reciprocal relationship with my community. And so that's why I'm developing this visual dictionary, because it's not just knowledge that I get to keep to use for my own artistic practice. It's knowledge that needs to be distributed to the community for their own, the betterment and the knowledge of the full community. And so, to be honest, how that will be distributed is a conversation that is going to be ongoing. I'll be, once I'm done with the dictionary, as far as I can take it, I'll take it to the community and we'll have a conversation about who gets access to this. Where is it going to be housed? Is it going to be at one of the local universities? Are we going to publish, say, a small run of print copies? Is it going to be available to band members? How is that going to happen? And that conversation is going to happen at the community level. And I actually can't answer how that will be distributed, because some of that knowledge really will need to be protected, but I don't have the answer for that. And so that will be coming through the community.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I just had a very brief question about the bone needles. And I was just wondering, what do you know what it is that makes them less damaging or traumatic than the metal needles that you would typically use?
To be honest, I have no idea.
Okay.
So a quick, short answer to a short question. But no, yeah, I don't know. I was actually quite surprised, and I would say a little bit nervous to use it, because it is significantly bigger than the metal needles. And, as I was learning to skin stitch on my own leg, and then eventually family and friends, because I taught myself using my own leg, and they tear quite easily. So I was quite nervous to do that, especially on Coyote for the first time. The first time using the bone needle on him, I was quite nervous, but I was surprised the 2 times that I've used the bone needle, the skin was just, it just was so resilient in comparison. It's pretty mind blowing. And, I think it's just part of that, the ingenious reality of our ancestors' knowledge.
So we have a couple of questions in the question area. And the first one is saying, do you see repeated motifs in different Indigenous tattoo designs?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you can definitely see repeating motifs all across the globe. For example, one repeating motif, of course, of just a triangle. And for us, that triangle is a mountain. For the Hawaiians, I believe it's shark teeth. You know, so in other communities have a variety of interpretations of what that motif is. Although of course it's repeating, just depending on, of course, where those people are coming from.
There was a second part to this question that asks, do you worry about appropriation?
Yeah, certainly. Appropriation is always a concern, but of course there is a delicate balance between protecting a lot of the knowledge, but then also understanding the reality of Indigenous people across Turtle Island, across the world, who, because of no fault of their own, are disconnected from their ancestral communities. And so you have people who are diasporic and are not connected to their community. And so it's a delicate balance between protecting designs, protecting that knowledge, and allowing access to community members who, you know, the reality is, in receiving that first tattoo that's connected to their community, starts them on a journey that helps to remember them back to our communities. So yes, of course, appropriation is a challenge, but it's just trying to, you know, have those initial conversations at the beginning of, you know, what should we share and what should we keep.
Okay, thank you. So there was another question that is asking about your use, or if you use the term cultural genocide to describe the destruction of Indigenous cultural practices, or do you consider that expression to be inaccurate or unhelpful?
Well, I think, to be honest, I think cultural genocide is too delicate a term, and it's a form of erasing the reality that is the reality of Indigenous people's life in the world, who experience, you know, intergenerational current trauma associated with a genocide, full stop. There is no, I think cultural genocide is a form of, what would you say, reducing the reality, and it doesn't go far enough to the fact that, yes, it was in fact genocide.
We have one more question in the question area, and it asks, what does the amount of time spent on these tattoo practices mean to you? Or how does the experience change when it becomes so much slower than when using a gun?
Well, I think it brings forward a few different things that I think are important to bring forward. Is, you know, part of the value of slowing down is one of the things that is very much missing in our everyday lived reality is connecting with other human beings. And so it's really about reconnecting with each other and remembering ourselves together. And we talk about the stitching of our communities back together so that we can move forward together. So the slowing down is an important part, of that process. But I would also put forward that, you know, when I look at the revival of our practices, don't have to necessarily look like our ancestors' practices did, because we are contemporary people living in a contemporary world. And I would say that there is a certain experience that is there when you get stitched with a bone needle, or you get tattooed using hand poke, that isn't there when you use a machine. However, I would say that being tattooed with the machine is similar to us not having to walk down the valley or to canoe down the river. We use vehicles. And so, you know, sometimes the most appropriate thing to use is a tattoo machine. And that's of course, my own interpretation, my own understanding of that reality. However, I think that, yes, there is something very spiritual about that. And for me, it's less about the method, to be honest with you, and it's more about the mark. It's about the experience of going through that internal journey of, you know, as my friend Gord says, giving a blood and pain sacrifice for the mark that you will take with you through the rest of your life.
Okay, so I checked the chat and there's more questions there, so we're not quite done. So there's another question regarding mentorship in your process and how it may inform your upcoming projects.
Could you ask that again? I'm not 100% sure.
It just states that a person has a question regarding mentorship in your process and how it may inform your upcoming projects.
I think mentorship is definitely part of the work that I do in teaching and giving. You know, I think it really talks about the reason why I do this work, not only for myself, but for communities that are not my own as well. So the founding of the Earthline Tattoo Collective with Amy Mulbuff and Jordan Bennett was really a way of, you know, giving support to communities that aren't mine. And one of my responsibilities, another answer to the creator's question of not only do I do this for my community, but share the knowledge that I have. And I think that, you know, part of that is because when I first started, there wasn't anyone to lean on, to talk to ask questions to gain support from. And so I'm trying to, you know, be that support for other people, help them in their own journeys. And then also, you know, Coyote visited Wong Odd, who is one of the last remaining Filipino Batok or masters of Filipino hand tap tattooing. And he talked about in this video the burden of carrying this cultural knowledge and bringing it forward for your community. And so it's also a way of distributing the responsibility among other people, so that, you know, I have people to lean on and to do that work with.
We have another question pertaining to the work of Lars Krutak, which you mentioned. And this person has said that they are teaching about global tattoo histories at Queen's, and they're wondering if you care to share what your views are on Lars Krutak as a potentially problematic figure. And they're wondering if he or scholars like him are perpetuating colonial legacies or working to dismantle them.
You know, it's an interesting question. And to be honest with you, I think that Lars Krutak, as a researcher, has always been super respectful and has done a lot of work that the vast majority of the people who are involved in the revival of their cultural tattooing practices are using his textbook, you know, using the work that he has done, a lot of work. Of course, you know, he arises out of an institution and a practice of anthropology, but that doesn't mean that his practice is perpetuating that. I wouldn't necessarily argue that. I would say that, you know, my experience with Lars has always been valuable. And any time that he has reached out to me or asked to publish anything that includes my voice or my vision or my understanding, he's always checked in and been completely, you know, completely, what would you say, respectful. And he has created a reciprocal relationship with me. And so my experience with Lars has been very good. And I think that it's a part of collaborating with us as people here on this continent, that we, you know, we're here together and we have to find a way to get along. And so, you know, the work of Lars, I've used it, I continue to use it. And yeah, I consider Lars, in all honesty, to be a friend and a colleague. And I think that, you know, we have to look at the individual and the work that they do, and to fully know who that person is before we make any comments about who that person is.
Okay, thank you. I believe those are all of the questions. I suppose we could wait another minute if anybody has any like burning questions that they want to ask. But otherwise, people are saying thank you and great talk.
Awesome.
Thank you so much, Dion. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And yeah, are there anything else you want to conclude with? Any concluding remarks, or the floor is yours?
I'm all good. I'm just thankful for the opportunity and for everyone who has tuned in. And it's an honor to be here and to share this time and space with everyone.
Thank you so much, Dion.
Thank you.
Kayla, so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks. So I guess we should do a plug for the other talks that are happening later this week. The other talks are the schedule of the other talks available this week are available on countermemoryactivism.ca or our Facebook and Instagram pages. And the talks happening later this week feature Michael Rothberg and Cyrus Marcus Ware. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.